Thoughts, perceptions, language, interpretation. These are the domains of Mercury in the natal chart. Mercury is the swift messenger of the gods, symbolizing the way your mind connects inner experience with the outer world. From the moment you drew your first breath, Mercury set in motion the lifelong pattern of noticing, naming, and making sense of reality. It imprinted your being with the habits of thought, the urge to learn, the rhythm of communication, the instinct to weave experience and perception into meaning. In astrology, Mercury speaks to your mind, your voice, your curiosity, and the bridges that you build between ideas, people, and possibilities. Mercury rules communication, after all. Mercury is the silver thread, the quicksilver thread to speak, that carries the light of awareness from one person to another, from you to another realm, or from other realms to you. Just as our thoughts interpret and reflect the experiences that come at us like rays of light, it governs the electric pulse of the mental world of which you operate within. My name is Dorje Kirsten, and I'm a professional astrologer, and you can find me at www.heartastrology.com. In this video, I'm going to look at Mercury as an essential inner planet, the archetype and symbolic factor in astrology, from four different distinct astrological, the traditional perspective, the psychological perspective, the evolutionary perspective, and the spiritual perspective. Each perspective offers a different way of understanding Mercury's role in your life, in your chart, and what it indicates by its placements. Together, they show us that Mercury is far more than how we think. If you enjoy this content, please check out the overview of the Sun and the Moon linked in the show notes, as they are similar in content. And don't forget to like and share this video as a good introductory primary to the planet Mercury in astrology. Traditional astrology, it's very, very archaic and structured and rigid and rule-based. In traditional astrology, Mercury is the swift-footed messenger of the gods. Neutral, meaning it can be feminine or masculine, dry, and subtle in nature. As described by authors such as Vettius Valens in the anthologies, Mercury signifies intellect, commerce, speech, calculation, interpretation, thieves, and actors, and all forms of exchange. Its conditions, speed, and placement show the clarity of one's thinking and the reliability of one's judgments. When dignified, Mercury grants eloquence, versatility, and reason. When afflicted, it can signify deceit, instability, and anxiety. Mercury's role as psychopomp, moving freely between realms, symbolizes its capacity to connect disparate forms of knowledge through language and mind. Traditional astrology is immensely complex in its diagnostic techniques, and the placement of Mercury, its condition, and aspects are not only predictive, but also illustrative of how a native's life will play out. For instance, a strongly placed Mercury in the 10th house in the sign of dignity and trine Jupiter would indicate a capacity to be a translator, a minister, a successful merchant who works for those in power. However, a poorly placed Mercury in the 12th house, square or opposed Mars, in a sign of its fall, such as Pisces, might indicate someone who is deceptive or lies or who is even backstabbed by the deceit of others and suffers terribly for it. So you see, traditional astrology is very fated in how it plays out when you look at planets within the chart. Now, psychological astrology is far more concerned with how the mind works and how the mind works through the symbols of the planets and how they interact with each other. This form of astrology was inspired by the works of Dane Rudhyar, Liz Green, and Howard Sasportas, amongst others. In this form of astrology, Mercury symbolizes the cognitive functions that mediates between inner experience and outer reality. To understand Mercury in this form of psychology, in this form of psychological astrology, we might look instead at perhaps the myths of Mercury that come from the Greeks to see how those myths inform the inner psyche and archetypes that we experience as humans. Howard Sasportas writes in the Inner Planets, Seminars in Psychology and Astrology, that Mercury speaks in many voices, representing not only rational thought, but also the imagination, trickster energy, and the inner dialogue from which meaning is made. Mercury describes here how we learn, our process of information and taking in information, articulating our needs, and weaving narrative from experience. For instance, he spends a good deal of time talking about how Mercury in Capricorn communicates about practical manners in a practical way. This is really interesting to me, and I find it interesting because if you look at synastry charts, and we don't often compare Mercury's and synastry charts as much as we do Venus and Mars or the sun and the moon for understanding how people get along. But if people have Mercuries opposed each other in a synastry chart, they cannot communicate clearly with one another, or their communication is fraught with difficulties. So when you look at your chart and someone you're in love with, or someone you're married to, or someone you have a relationship with that you want to continue, and there are oppositional Mercuries, then you really have to work and try hard to understand where that person is coming from. This is a really important principle of Mercury and how you find it within your chart and within other people's charts and how those connect. Mercury's sign reveals one's preferred communication style, but also mental style. So again, Mercury in Capricorn would mean that the mental style is very pragmatic. Its aspects show how thoughts, emotions, instincts blend or conflict within each other as a person describes the experiences of their life. A fascinating point Howard Sasportas makes in his work is that Mercury Combust produces psychologies that are more subjective. Combust means within 6 degrees orb of the sun. Mercury, and free of the rays of the sun, however, that is further out than 6 degrees, produces people who are more objective in their understanding of the world. As you look at people's charts, your own and others, you may see how this works. Now, the next way of looking at Mercury is through the lens of the evolutionary astrology school. Evolutionary astrology is a way of understanding astrology articulated by both Jeff Green and Stephen Forrest in different ways. In this tradition, Mercury represents the soul's habitual patterns of perception and communication carried over from prior lifetimes. So, for instance, if you have a Mercury in Virgo, your pattern of communication might be distinctly critical and analytical, and you might have to learn how to use that in a way that is productive and does not upset others. We all know that Virgo is considered to be highly critical by many people when it's in the astrology chart of someone, that it forms a personality that is highly critical. And so the Virgo Mercury is going to spend its life learning how to communicate its analytical insight in a way that does not sound critical to others. Of course, that's harder or easier depending on how it's aspected. For instance, again, a Mercury squared or opposed Mars is just going to come off really harshly. It's a little bit of an insightful superpower, but it has to be learned to be dealt with care. These ingrained mental filters of the position of Mercury shape how we interpret reality in this life and how that interpretation comes from past life habits, or at least that's the thinking of evolutionary astrology. Mercury shows where the mind may cling to old strategies of analysis, defense, or meaning-making. While it is the moon that reveals emotional memory, Mercury shows cognitive memory, the assumptions and interpretations that feel familiar and how we interpret our reality in those manners. Consciously engaging Mercury's placement helps loosen rigid mental habits so the soul can evolve beyond outdated narratives and develop more inclusive understandings of truth, more holistic understandings of truth. Spiritual astrology is esoteric. It's about what is truly within. Now, some people define spiritual astrology as the works of Alice Bailey and the Theosophist. I take it and approach it more from my understanding of spirituality as someone who has spent a lot of years meditating and who spent a lot of time training in solitary retreats in the mountains. What I consider Mercury to be in spiritual astrology is the bridge between the concrete mind and the higher mind, or the conceptual mind and the mind free of concepts. Mercury represents your thoughts. Such, it is always transitional and impermanent. As our thoughts are always changing, they're never the same. Now pause for a moment, pause this video, and contemplate how you thought differently when you were 5 versus now. And then think about how you'll probably think differently in 30 years versus now. So you can see from that our thoughts are not stable, they are always changing. But we have rigid concepts. We are stuck in fixating upon the permanence of our ideas and them having concrete meaning that is superior to anyone else's ideas, which is, of course, a false absurdity because we live with an interdependent relationship with all other humans. And Mercury is the way we communicate that relationship. The flexibility of Mercury, the way that the mind changes, the way that thoughts changes, is an essential tool for becoming someone who can live in harmony with everybody. Because everybody who comes at you with their perspective, that perspective is true to them. And everybody who comes at you with their ideas and their thoughts and their words, you need to understand, or you should understand, that they are empty of meaning outside of how that person views the world and the universe. How you view the world and the universe is very important to you, but it is empty in meaning to other people in the long term because everybody is coming at the world and the universe from their own perspective. And Mercury is the quality of how you communicate that perspective. So then, if your Mercury, again, let's say if your Mercury is in Cancer, the sign of the crab, which is a water sign, it's a very emotional sign, then your communication methodology is going to be emotional. But if you're talking to someone whose Mercury is, say, in Aquarius, their communication is going to be intellectual. So the challenge on a spiritual level is going to be understanding how your communication is not their communication. What you're saying is going to be heard by them from a perspective of a different soul being who was raised in different circumstances than you. This shows the fluidity of thoughts. And the fluidity of thoughts points to this real beautiful essence that the moment you look at your thought, the moment you look at a thought, meditate upon a thought, that thought changes and dissolves into the space from which it comes. So this is represented by Mercury's swift motion and how it constantly transforms its meaning as it circles around the zodiac. Mercury represents the capacity for insight, symbolic reasoning, and alignment of thought with spiritual being. When elevated, Mercury guides a practitioner towards right speech, contemplative clarity, the focus on the breath, the in-breath and the out-breath, as a principle of centering in the soul of their being, and the ability to perceive subtle correspondences within creation and receive messages from beings who are more evolved, teachers, whether they're embodied by humans or whether they're embodied by other beings who are outside of the human realm, that are there to help guide us into the understanding of what it is to be a spiritual being in a spiritual universe. This is what Mercury represents. And you can look into your chart and the location of Mercury for clues about how that can come to you. Taken together, these 4 perspectives reveal that Mercury is not just a symbol of the intellect, but an indication of the dynamic process of thinking, interpreting, and transmitting meaning. Its placement in the birth chart points towards lessons of communication, clarity, and conscious awareness each soul is invited to cultivate to deepen its relationship to the whole of being, the world soul, and eternity, as well as differentiate its own individual being and communicate its uniqueness to the world. Now, this is just a toe in the water of the symbology of Mercury and what it represents and the richness that it brings to you through the study of astrology. But if you enjoyed this video, be sure to watch the video on the sun and the moon in the show notes. They are similar, and I'm going to go through all of the planets in this way. The next video on this series will be on Venus. Now, please, if you want to see more, like, subscribe, and share this video. It encourages me to put out more. Until the next time I see you then, Be contemplative, mindful, conscious, and aware. Be innerly reflective and do good. Thank you very much, and see you again later.